He was one of the richest men in the country, a titan of technology whose innovations shaped the digital landscape, but Julian Vance's vast fortune could not buy back the sound his daughter had lost. After firing 7 maids in as many months for failing to adhere to the sterile, silent protocols of his mansion, he was on the verge of giving up. Each had tried to fix 7-year-old Lily, to coax her from the silent world she had inhabited for 2 years, ever since the fever that had stolen her hearing and, shortly thereafter, the car crash that had stolen her mother. They failed, and Julian's grief-hardened heart had no room for failure. Then a woman named Clara Mayhew arrived for an interview. She was unlike the others, quiet, with an economy of movement, and eyes that held a deep, settled sadness that resonated with the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She had a painful past he could sense, but didn't ask about. He hired her on the spot, with one non-negotiable condition. She was to clean, to be invisible, and to leave his daughter entirely alone. But Clara was an observer, and it was a quiet observation, a shocking sight, on her 3rd day of work that would break Julian Vance completely and change everything he thought he knew about silence. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Vance mansion was less a home and more a mausoleum. Perched on a cliff overlooking the city, its vast glass walls and polished marble floors reflected a life of meticulous order and profound emptiness. Every surface gleamed, every corner was sharp, every sound was absorbed by expensive rugs and the heavy weight of sorrow. Julian moved through it like a ghost, his days a blur of board meetings and financial reports, his nights a silent vigil in his study, a glass of amber liquid his only companion. He loved his daughter with a fierce, desperate intensity, but he did not know how to reach her. Her silence was a mirror to his own failings, a constant screaming reminder of all he had lost. The doctors, led by the esteemed Dr. Alistair Finch, a family friend, had been clear: profound, irreversible sensorineural hearing loss. Lily lived in a world without sound, and Julian had walled off his own heart in solidarity. Clara Mayhew understood silence. Her own life had been hollowed out by it 5 years prior, when the laughter of her younger brother, Leo, had been permanently extinguished by an illness that doctors had misdiagnosed until it was too late. She wore his small silver locket under her uniform, a cold, constant pressure against her sternum. She didn't seek the job at the Vance mansion for the money, though it was substantial. She sought the quiet. She sought a place where her own internal stillness wouldn't feel so out of place. On her first day, Julian's house manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, gave her the tour, her voice a low, reverent whisper, as if in a library or a church. The rules were simple and absolute. Lily's wing was to be cleaned only between 9 and 11 in the morning, when she was with her private tutor. No sudden movements, no loud noises, a pointless but ingrained habit of the house. And above all, no direct interaction with the child. Mr. Vance believes consistency and a lack of emotional stimuli are best for her adjustment, Mrs. Gable had explained, her face impassive. For 2 days, Clara complied. She moved through the silent halls, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She polished surfaces that were already spotless, dusted furniture that held no dust. She caught glimpses of Lily, a small, pale girl with enormous dark eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. She was always clutching a small, worn wooden bird, its paint faded from years of handling. The child moved with a preternatural quietness, a little wraith in her own home. She never looked at anyone, her gaze fixed on some distant internal landscape. The tutor, a young woman with a perpetually strained smile, would attempt to engage her with picture books and textured blocks, but Lily remained impassive, her small hand stroking the wooden bird, which she called Pip. It was on the third day that the fragile, ordered silence of Clara's new reality was fractured. She was in Lily's bedroom, dusting the large bay window that overlooked the winding road leading up to the estate. It was 10:30, and the tutor was reading in a corner, her voice a gentle murmur that was more for her own benefit than the child's. Lily was sitting on the floor nearby, arranging a set of colored stones into a spiral. She was, as always, utterly absorbed in her own world. Down on the road, a vintage sports car, likely belonging to a wealthy neighbor, was having engine trouble. It backfired, a sharp, percussive crack that echoed off the cliff face. It was loud enough to make the tutor jump, and Mrs. Gable, who was passing in the hallway, let out a small gasp. Clara's eyes, however, were fixed on Lily. The child's reaction was minuscule, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a jump or a cry. It was a subtle, lightning-fast tightening of her shoulders and a sharp, involuntary turn of her head just a few degrees in the direction of the window, of the sound. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her face smoothed back into its familiar, vacant mask. She immediately dropped her gaze back to her stones, her tiny fingers resuming their task as if nothing had happened. The tutor hadn't seen it. Mrs. Gable hadn't seen it. But Clara, whose life had been defined by observing the small, telling signs of a loved one's hidden suffering, had seen it. It was a flicker of a candle in a hurricane, but it was there. A child diagnosed with profound, irreversible deafness should not have reacted to a sound she could not possibly have heard. In that instant, in the silent, sterile room, a seed of suspicion was planted in Clara's mind, a dangerous, fragile thing that promised to shatter the mansion's carefully constructed peace. The first crack had appeared in the wall of silence, and Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not leave it alone. The house had rules, but some truths were more important. The image of Lily's subtle flinch replayed in Clara's mind on a loop. It was the key, she felt, to a door everyone else believed was permanently locked. The official narrative was a fortress, a sudden, high fever, a brutal ear infection, and then silence. Dr. Finch's diagnosis was scripture in this house, his pronouncements treated with the gravity of a divine verdict. Yet Clara had seen what she had seen. Her grief for Leo had sharpened her senses, teaching her that the most important truths are often whispered, not shouted. She knew the subtle language of the body when it tried to betray a secret the mind was forced to keep. That night, in her small Spartan room in the staff wing, she thought not of the child's deafness, but of what might be pretending to be deafness. Her work became a cover for her observation. She started a series of quiet, methodical experiments, each one designed to be dismissed as coincidence if noticed. She began by testing vibrations. While Lily was in the library with her tutor, Clara would vacuum the hallway outside, pressing the machine against the base of the wall. She watched Lily through the sliver of open doorway. There was no reaction. The vibrations were too diffuse. The next day, while cleaning the grand living room, she saw Lily sitting on the floor, focused on her wooden bird. Clara, on the other side of the large room, intentionally dropped a heavy coffee table book onto the thick Persian rug. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Lily didn't move. Clara's heart sank a little. Perhaps she had imagined it. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking, a projection of her own desire to heal the broken. But she didn't give up. She shifted her focus from loud, jarring noises to something softer, more nuanced. She remembered how Leo, in his final weeks, had been sensitive not to volume, but to pitch. She began to hum. It was a simple, nameless tune, a little melody she'd made up years ago to soothe her brother. She hummed it under her breath as she polished the silver in the dining room, as she arranged flowers in the foyer, as she wiped down the kitchen counters. She made sure to do it when Lily was in the same or an adjacent room. For days, there was nothing. Lily remained a porcelain doll, lost in her internal world. During this time, Clara paid close attention to Lily's hands. The child was never still. Her fingers were constantly in motion, not in a nervous, fidgety way, but with a strange, deliberate quality. When she held Pip, her thumb would tap twice on its head, then rub its smooth wooden back. Tap, tap, rub. When she was looking out the window, her index finger would trace the same pattern on the cold glass. Tap, tap, rub. It was a recurring motif, a piece of silent syntax. Was it just a comforting habit, a self-soothing gesture, or was it something more? Clara began to feel she was on the precipice of a language no one else had bothered to learn. She started practicing the gesture herself in the privacy of her room, feeling the rhythm of it, trying to understand its shape and meaning. Meanwhile, Julian Vance remained a distant, formidable presence. He would see Clara in the hallways and offer a curt, dismissive nod, his eyes gliding past her as if she were another piece of expensive, inanimate furniture. His internal world was a storm of unresolved grief and crushing guilt. Every time he looked at Lily, he saw his late wife, Elena. He saw her smile, her spirit, and he saw the void her absence had left in their daughter. He'd thrown money at the problem, the best doctors, therapists, tutors, all in a desperate attempt to build a functional life for Lily. But it was a life without joy, a carefully managed existence. He clung to Dr. Finch's diagnosis because it was concrete. It was a medical fact, something he could understand in a world that had become emotionally incomprehensible. The doctor, a man who had been at his wedding and had held Lily as a baby, was his rock. Finch assured him that this quiet, ordered environment was the best way to prevent Lily from becoming overwhelmed. Julian, lost at sea, had clung to this advice like a life raft, never questioning whether the raft itself was sound. One afternoon, Julian was working from his home study, the door slightly ajar. He was on a conference call, his voice the low, confident baritone that commanded boardrooms. Clara was dusting the long hallway outside. Lily was sitting on the floor not far from the study door, playing with her stones. As Clara worked her way closer, she began to hum her little tune, pitching it low and soft. She watched Lily from the corner of her eye. The girl's hands, which had been methodically placing stones, stilled for a brief moment. It was barely a pause, a single skipped beat in her quiet rhythm. But it was a reaction. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through Clara's cautious exterior. She took a small risk. She continued humming, and as she knelt to wipe the baseboard near Lily, she let her own hand fall to her side, and, with her back mostly to the child, she performed the gesture. Tap, tap, rub against the fabric of her uniform. Lily's head shot up, her eyes wide and dark, locked onto Clara's back. She wasn't supposed to be looking. She was never supposed to be looking, but she was. She stared, her mouth slightly agape, the colored stone in her hand forgotten. Julian's voice droned on from the study, a meaningless background noise. In the hallway, a silent electric conversation was taking place. Clara held her breath, not daring to move, not daring to turn around and break the spell. She had sent a message in a language she didn't understand, and for the first time, it seemed someone had received it. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was charged with unspoken possibility. The solarium was Elena's sanctuary. It was a grand glass-domed room at the back of the mansion, filled with exotic plants that were now meticulously, if joylessly, tended by a contracted gardener. After his wife's death, Julian had locked the doors. It was too painful a reminder of her vibrant life. But Mrs. Gable, citing the humidity's effect on the woodwork, had insisted on leaving the doors open during the day. It remained an untouched shrine, beautiful and sterile. Clara found herself drawn to it. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and faint phantom blossoms. She felt a whisper of life in that room that was absent from the rest of the house. One afternoon she took her cleaning supplies there, though it wasn't on her official schedule. She began to gently wipe the leaves of a large fiddle-leaf fig, her movements slow and rhythmic. She started humming her tune, the simple melody now a beacon she was sending out into the quiet. A few minutes later, a small shadow fell across the threshold. It was Lily, standing just outside the solarium, her hand clutching the wooden bird, Pip. She watched Clara with an unnerving stillness, her expression unreadable. This was a departure from her routine. Lily never deviated from her designated path between her room, the library, and the dining room. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she gave no outward sign that she'd noticed her audience. She kept her back to the child, continuing to tend to the plants, her soft humming filling the warm, humid air. She decided to take the next step. While humming, she brought her free hand up and performed the gesture she had copied from Lily, the one that had elicited a reaction in the hall. Tap, tap, rub, a gentle, questioning rhythm in the air. She did it without looking, a silent offering. From the doorway, there was a sharp intake of breath. Clara stopped humming, her hand frozen in midair. She waited, every nerve ending alight. She heard the whisper soft sound of bare feet on the cool marble floor. Lily was moving into the room, slowly, cautiously. Clara turned. The little girl had taken 3 hesitant steps inside and was standing there, her enormous eyes fixed on Clara. They were no longer vacant. They were filled with a profound, desperate curiosity. For the first time since Clara had arrived, Lily was truly seeing her. Clara knelt down, making herself smaller, less intimidating. She offered a small, tentative smile. She hummed the first 2 notes of the melody again, and then, very deliberately, she made the gesture once more. Tap, tap, rub. Lily's eyes welled with tears. Her small chest hitched with a sob she could not make. She looked from Clara's face to her hand, and then down at the wooden bird she was clutching so tightly it was a wonder it didn't splinter. A tiny sound escaped her lips. It was not a word, not even a syllable. It was a breathy, vocalized whimper, a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion that had been trapped behind a wall of silence for 2 years. It was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever heard. Then Lily did something that sealed Clara's conviction. She lifted her own small, trembling hand. Her fingers were clumsy, shaky with the weight of the moment, but she mimicked the gesture back to Clara. Tap, tap, rub. It was a confirmation, a greeting, an answer. It was a conversation. In that moment, the entire foundation of Lily's diagnosis crumbled into dust. This was not a deaf child. This was a child who was trapped, a child who was trying to speak in the only way she knew how, and for 2 years no one had been listening. Hope, so fragile before, now bloomed in Clara's chest with an intensity that was almost painful. She had made contact. But this breakthrough, this miraculous, shared secret, was about to be discovered, and its discovery would unleash a storm upon the silent, grieving house. The fragile peace was over. A war for Lily's voice was about to begin. Julian Vance's day had been a particular shade of hell. A hostile takeover bid from a rival, Marcus Thorne of Sterling Corp, had come out of nowhere, forcing him into a grueling day-long emergency board meeting. He was exhausted, his temper frayed to a single, taut wire. He drove home in a state of controlled fury, the looming corporate battle just another weight on his already burdened shoulders. He entered the mansion, expecting the usual oppressive silence to soothe his shattered nerves. Instead, he heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A sound that didn't belong. Humming? It was coming from the back of the house, from the one place he tried never to go, the solarium. A cold dread, quickly followed by white-hot anger, washed over him. The rules were explicit. The staff was not to be in that room. It was Elena's. He strode down the long marble hallway, his expensive shoes clicking an aggressive rhythm against the floor. He pushed open the glass-paned door with more force than necessary, ready to unleash his fury on whichever employee had dared to transgress. but the sight that greeted him stopped him dead. The scene froze him in place, every angry word dying in his throat. There, in the center of the room, bathed in the golden late afternoon light filtering through the glass dome, was Clara, the new maid. She was kneeling on the floor, and kneeling opposite her, closer than he'd seen her to another human being in 2 years, was Lily. His daughter's face, usually a pale, emotionless mask, was alive. Her eyes were wide, focused, and glistening with unshed tears. Her cheeks were flushed. She was leaning forward, utterly captivated by the maid. Clara was humming a soft, simple tune, and as she hummed, she was making a strange gesture with her hand, a rhythmic tapping and rubbing. And then Julian's world tilted on its axis. He watched as his silent daughter, his deaf daughter, lifted her own small hand and clumsily mirrored the gesture back. It was not a mindless imitation. It was a response, a communication. A light was on in his daughter's eyes that he thought had been extinguished forever. For a moment he was simply stunned, a spectator to a miracle he couldn't comprehend. But his grief and his ingrained need for control quickly soured the moment into suspicion. Who was this woman? What was she doing? He had hired her to be invisible. And here she was, at the very heart of his family's sacred pain, performing some kind of parlor trick on his vulnerable child. "What is going on here?" he boomed, his voice unnaturally loud in the tranquil space, shattering the delicate intimacy of the scene. Clara jumped, her eyes flying to his, wide with fear. Lily flinched violently, a strangled gasp escaping her lips, and immediately scrambled backward, retreating into herself. The light in her eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar dull vacancy. She snatched up her wooden bird from the floor and clutched it to her chest, her shield against the world, her gaze dropping to the floor. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Julian had broken the spell. "I gave you specific instructions," he snarled, advancing on Clara. "You were not to interact with her. You were not to come in this room. What do you think you're doing?" His voice was low and dangerous. Clara scrambled to her feet, her hands clasped in front of her as if in supplication. "Mr. Vance, please," she whispered, her voice trembling but earnest. "You don't understand. She can hear. I know she can. She's been trying to tell us." Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a bitter, ugly sound. "She can hear? Are you a doctor now? I have consulted with the top specialists in the country. My daughter is deaf. What you are doing is cruel. You are giving her false hope, and you're taking advantage of a grieving family. You're fired. Get your things and get out." "No, please, just listen," Clara begged, taking a step forward. "The gesture, the one we were doing, she does it all the time. It's her sign. I think she's trying to talk." "It's a nervous tic, a habit," Julian shot back, his mind clinging to the solid, painful facts he had built his life around for the past 2 years. "Doctor," Finch's words echoed in his head. "The damage is profound, Julian. We need to focus on acceptance, not false cures. You see what you want to see. Now get out of my house." He reached for Clara's arm to escort her out, his face a mask of cold fury. But before his fingers could touch her, a small, fierce force intervened. Lily, who had been a silent statue of fear, suddenly launched herself forward. She didn't make a sound, but her actions screamed. She ran and planted herself directly in front of Clara, shielding her from Julian. She spread her small arms wide, a tiny, defiant protector. Her face was contorted with a terror and a plea so raw that it physically jolted Julian. She looked up at her father, her eyes swimming with tears, and she began to make the gesture, tap, tap, rub, over and over, frantically, desperately, her small hand a blur of motion. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a tic. It was a word she was screaming at him in a language he couldn't understand. Don't. Stop. Listen. The sight of his daughter, his passive, withdrawn daughter, defending this stranger with such ferocity, broke something in him. The anger, the suspicion, the carefully constructed walls of denial, they all crumbled, leaving him exposed and utterly bewildered. He stared at Lily, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a collection of symptoms to be managed, but as a person, his child, who was in profound distress. He lowered his hand. His breath hitched. He looked from his terrified daughter to the equally terrified maid she was protecting. The logic of the past 2 years was at war with the undeniable truth in front of him. He sank to his knees, bringing himself to Lily's eye level. His voice, when it finally came, was a ragged whisper, stripped of all its authority. "Show me," he said to Clara, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face, "show me everything." The old alliance with doctors and diagnoses was broken. A new fragile one had just been forged in the silent sunlit room. The mansion, once a bastion of rigid schedules and unspoken rules, transformed into a laboratory of hope. Julian, having crossed a mental Rubicon, threw the full force of his formidable intellect and resources into Clara's theory. He canceled all his meetings, delegating the corporate battle to his second-in-command. His daughter was now his only priority. He and Clara established a base of operations in his vast, leather-bound study, a room that had previously been his solitary refuge. Now its large mahogany desk was littered not with financial projections, but with Lily's developmental records, medical charts, and Clara's handwritten notes on the child's behaviors. "It started with the car backfiring," Clara explained, her voice steady now that she had an ally. "She flinched. It was tiny, but it was a reaction to the sound." She then detailed her quiet experiments, the humming, and her observations of the tap-tap-rub gesture. Julian listened, his expression a mixture of awe and self-recrimination. "I never saw it," he murmured, shaking his head. "I was here the whole time, and I never saw any of it." "You were told what to see," Clara said gently. "You were grieving. You trusted the people who were supposed to help." Her words were meant to comfort, but they lit a fuse in Julian's mind. Trust. He had trusted Dr. Finch implicitly. The man had been more than a doctor. He was a friend who had guided the family through Elena's death, and then Lily's diagnosis. The thought that Finch could be wrong felt like a betrayal. The thought that he could be intentionally wrong was unimaginable. Not yet. "Tell me about the illness," Clara urged. "The one that they said caused this. Everything you can remember." Julian leaned back, his eyes unfocused as he traveled back 2 years into the fog of his deepest grief. "It was about a month after the accident," he began, his voice low. "Lily she wasn't herself. Quiet, withdrawn. I thought it was grief. Then she got a fever, a really high one, and a terrible ear infection. Dr. Finch handled everything. He said it was aggressive, that we needed an equally aggressive treatment to save her hearing. He prescribed some powerful antibiotic. Eardrops, I think. A nurse he hired came every day to administer them." "Eardrops," Clara repeated, her mind latching onto the detail. She thought of the gesture. Tap, tap, rub, like an eyedropper. Tap, tap to get the drop ready, rub to soothe the ache. A chill went down her spine. "Where are her medical files?" Clara asked. "The ones from that time." Julian led her to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of the study. He hadn't looked at them since they were first filed away. It was too painful. He unlocked it, and together they pulled out a thick folder labeled Lily Vance. They spread the documents across the desk, page after page of medical jargon, charts, and Dr. Finch's flowing, confident signature. Clara, though not a doctor, had spent enough time in hospitals with her brother to have a layman's understanding. She found the prescription sheets. The medication was an experimental autotoxic drug known to carry a risk of hearing damage in rare cases. But what struck her was the dosage and duration. It seemed incredibly high for a 7-year-old child, administered for 6 full weeks. While Julian scanned the medical reports, Clara found a different kind of record. Tucked into a side pocket of the folder was a large envelope filled with Lily's drawings. "Mrs. Gable must have saved these," Julian said quietly. The first drawings were from before Elena's death. They were a riot of color, bright yellow suns, green trees, a smiling mother, father, and a daughter holding hands. Then came the drawings from after the accident. The colors muted. The figures became smaller, farther apart. Then came the art from the period of her illness. These were disturbing. The pages were filled with dark, scribbled shapes. There were pictures of a little girl lying in bed, her head surrounded by angry black and gray swirls, concentrated around her ears. In one, a tall, thin man with round glasses, a man who looked chillingly like Dr. Finch, was standing over the girl, holding something small and dark near her ear. The girl in the drawing wasn't peaceful. Her eyes were wide with fear. "My God," Julian breathed, staring at the drawing. "She was trying to tell you," Clara whispered. "She was scared. She wasn't just sick." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place later that evening. They were sitting in silence, the weight of their discoveries heavy in the air. Lily, who now spent most of her time near Clara, was sitting on the floor, drawing with a new set of crayons they had given her. She was humming the little tune that Clara always hummed. Julian watched her, his heart a painful knot in his chest. He noticed an old half-empty bottle of prescription eardrops on a high shelf, missed during the initial clean-out of medical supplies. It was the drug Dr. Finch had prescribed. He took it down, a relic from the worst time in his life. He looked at the bottle, then at Lily's drawing of the man with the glasses. He looked at Clara, then at his daughter's hand, as she absently tapped her crayon on the paper. Tap, tap. Then he looked back at the bottle in his hand, a small dark vial that held the key to his daughter's stolen voice. An idea, cold and terrifying, began to form in his mind. This wasn't a case of medical misjudgment. This was something far, far worse. The investigation had just begun, but it was no longer about finding a cure. It was about uncovering a crime. The next morning, Julian Vance was no longer a grieving father. He was a man on a mission. He dispatched a trusted courier with the old bottle of eardrops to a private independent laboratory in another state, one with no ties to the city's medical community. The instructions were simple: a full chemical breakdown, priority 1. He paid an exorbitant fee for a 24-hour turnaround. While they waited, he and Clara created a new, gentle routine for Lily. They spent hours in the solarium, which was slowly transforming from a memorial into a living space. Clara brought in soft cushions and blankets. Julian, for the first time in years, got his hands dirty, helping her repot a wilting orchid. They communicated with Lily using the simple language she had invented. They hummed the tune. They used the tap-tap-rub gesture to mean hello or it's okay. They invented new, simple signs, building a fragile bridge into her world. The effect on Lily was astonishing. The vacant, haunted look was receding, replaced by flashes of curiosity and even moments of quiet playfulness. She began to use new gestures of her own, pointing to a flower and then touching her nose, a clear sign for smell. She was a brilliant locked-in child who was finally being given a key. The lab results arrived via a secure digital courier the following afternoon. Julian opened the encrypted file in his study, Clara standing anxiously behind him. The report was dense with chemical terminology, but the summary on the first page was brutally clear. The primary ingredient was, as expected, the powerful antibiotic listed on the label, but it was mixed with a second unlisted compound. Julian's blood ran cold as he read the description. It was a sophisticated, non-lethal neurosuppressant, a chemical agent designed to cause temporary paralysis in delicate muscle tissues. The lab notes specified that when administered directly into the ear canal in sustained doses, it would induce a state of conductive hearing loss by inhibiting the function of the ossicles, the tiny bones responsible for transmitting sound waves. It wouldn't damage the auditory nerve itself, but it would effectively and painfully deafen the subject for as long as it was in their system. The report concluded, "This is not a therapeutic agent. Its composition suggests a deliberate and malicious intent to simulate profound deafness." The room fell silent, the hum of the computer the only sound. Julian stared at the screen, the words blurring. Malicious intent. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't malpractice. It was a deliberate, calculated poisoning of his child. Dr. Finch, his friend, the man who had comforted him at his wife's funeral, had systematically tortured his daughter. "Why?" Clara whispered, her hand coming to her mouth. "Why would he do this?" That question propelled Julian into the final phase of his investigation. This was no longer just about medicine, it was about motive. Money was the most likely answer. He hired a team of forensic accountants, the best in the business, giving them a single name, Dr. Alistair Finch. He wanted every transaction, every debt, every investment from the last 3 years. While the accountants dug, Julian revisited his own business dealings. The hostile takeover attempt by Marcus Thorne was still a major threat. Thorne was a ruthless competitor he had outmaneuvered for a massive government contract 3 years prior. The loss had nearly bankrupted Sterling Corp, and Thorne had vowed revenge, but Julian had dismissed it as corporate posturing. Now, he wondered. The pieces began to slot together with sickening speed. The forensic accountants called within hours. 2 years ago, Dr. Finch, who had been on the verge of personal bankruptcy due to a series of disastrous investments, had suddenly paid off all his debts. The source of his newfound wealth was a grant of $2 million to his private research foundation. The grant came from a philanthropic entity called the Nightingale Trust. It took Julian's team less than an hour to pierce the veil of shell corporations. The Nightingale Trust was funded by a holding company, which was, in turn, a subsidiary of Sterling Corp, Marcus Thorne's company. The full monstrous picture was now clear. It was a conspiracy of breathtaking cruelty. Thorne, wanting revenge and a competitive advantage, had paid Dr. Finch to neutralize Julian, not by killing him, but by breaking him emotionally, by taking the one thing he had left to live for, his daughter. By locking her in a silent prison, they knew Julian would become distracted, emotionally crippled, unable to effectively lead his company. Lily's induced deafness was a strategic weapon in a corporate war. Her daily suffering was a means to an end. Julian felt a rage so pure and cold it was almost sublime. He looked at Clara, her face pale with horror. He thought of Lily, humming softly in the next room, a child slowly emerging from a nightmare she never should have endured. He had failed to protect her. He had left her in the care of a monster. That failure would now be redeemed. He picked up his phone, not to call the police, not yet. This required a more personal touch. He would gather his evidence, build an ironclad case, and then he would not only destroy Thorne and Finch in a courtroom, he would obliterate their lives, their reputations, and everything they had ever built. The grieving father was gone, replaced by an avenging angel with limitless resources and a righteous fury. The central, horrifying truth had been revealed, and now the retribution would begin. The enemy, however, was not idle. Dr. Finch and Marcus Thorne were men who had built their lives on contingency plans and paranoia. Finch, through his position on the board of the city's most exclusive private hospital, received automated alerts for any high-level lab work ordered by prominent citizens. The request from Julian Vance for a full chemical assay, flagged for its unusual urgency and routed to an out-of-state lab, had tripped an alarm. Finch immediately alerted Thorne. They knew they had been discovered. Their response was not to retreat, but to attack with overwhelming, scorched earth force. The retaliation began the next morning. It was a coordinated, multi-front assault designed to discredit Julian and remove Clara from the equation entirely. The first blow came from the media. A notorious online tabloid known for its vicious character assassinations and secretly funded by one of Thorne's media holdings, published a shocking lead story. The headline, in bold, aggressive font, read, "Grieving Billionaire's Dangerous Delusion. Julian Vance, under influence of scheming new maid, denies daughter's deafness, engages in quack home therapies." The article was a masterpiece of malicious insinuation. It painted Julian as an unstable recluse, unable to accept his daughter's tragic reality. It portrayed Clara as a manipulative charlatan, a gold digger preying on a vulnerable family, referencing her modest background and lack of formal medical training. Anonymous sources close to the family, likely a disgruntled former maid paid for her story, were quoted expressing concern for Lily's well-being. Julian was still reeling from the public smear campaign when the second, more devastating blow fell. The doorbell chimed, and Mrs. Gable, her face ashen, announced that there were two people from Child Protective Services at the door. A smartly dressed woman and a grim-faced man presented Julian with an emergency removal order. An anonymous, detailed complaint had been filed, citing emotional abuse and medical neglect. The tabloid article was attached as supporting evidence. The complaint alleged that Julian, influenced by an unqualified domestic employee, was denying his daughter proper medical care and subjecting her to stressful, confusing treatments that were causing her severe emotional distress. "This is insane," Julian stammered, the legal document trembling in his hand. "This is a lie. My daughter is not being neglected. She is getting better." The CPS agent's face was a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "Mr. Vance, we have a court order. The complaint raises serious concerns. We need to take Lily into protective custody while we conduct a full investigation. It's for her safety." Clara, who had come running at the sound of the commotion, felt the floor drop out from under her. "No," she breathed. "You can't. You'll terrify her." But it was already happening. The agents were professional but unyielding. They moved towards Lily, who was standing in the archway of the living room, clutching Pip, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed anything she had shown before. She understood the tone, the tension, the invasion of her home by strangers. When the female agent knelt down and reached for her, Lily let out a silent scream, her mouth opening wide in a rictus of fear. She scrambled backward, straight into Clara's arms, burying her face in her legs. The agents exchanged a look. "You see," the man said to Julian, "she's clearly in distress. The child is terrified." "She's terrified of you," Julian roared, his control finally snapping. But it was useless. The law was on their side. They were gentle but firm as they separated the trembling child from Clara. Lily's small hands clawed at Clara's uniform, her eyes screaming a plea. As they led her out the door, she looked back, her face a mess of silent tears, and made the tap-tap-rub gesture one last time. A desperate goodbye. The front door closed, and the mansion was plunged into a silence more profound and terrible than ever before. Lily was gone. Julian stood in the center of the foyer, a statue of impotent rage. He had been outmaneuvered, his wealth and power rendered meaningless by a well-placed lie. Thorne and Finch had not only discovered his investigation, they had turned his love for his daughter into a weapon against him. They had taken her. As a final cruel twist, the emergency order stipulated that Clara Mayhew, the source of the delusion, was to be immediately dismissed from her position and barred from the premises pending the investigation. They had not just taken his daughter, they had ripped away her only lifeline, the one person who could understand her. The crisis was absolute. Julian Vance had lost everything all over again. For a full hour after the CPS agents left, Julian remained motionless in the foyer. The silence of the house pressed in on him, no longer empty, but filled with the phantom echo of his daughter's stolen presence. The rage had cooled into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. He had allowed his grief to make him passive, to make him a victim, never again. His transformation, which had begun in the solarium, was now complete. The cold, calculating titan of industry he had been in the boardroom merged with the raw, protective fury of a father. This was not a corporate takeover. This was a war, and he would use every weapon in his considerable arsenal to win it. His first call was not to his lawyers, but to Clara. He found her in her room, packing her small bag, her face pale and stained with tears. "Stop," he said, his voice quiet but steel hard. "You're not going anywhere." "The court order," she began. "The court order says you cannot be an employee in this house," he interrupted. "It says nothing about you being my guest, my partner. You're staying in the main guest suite. We are going to fight this together. I can't do this without you, Clara. Lily can't." The gratitude and determination in her eyes were all the answer he needed. He set her up in a luxurious suite that overlooked the ocean, a world away from her Spartan staff quarters. It was a war room now. His second call was to his legal team, not his corporate lawyers, but a legendary semi-retired trial lawyer named Benjamin Carter, a man known for taking on impossible cases and eviscerating his opponents in court. Julian told him everything, from the fake diagnosis to the corporate conspiracy. Carter, intrigued by the sheer audacity of the crime, agreed to take the case. "They fired the first shot," Carter said, his voice a gravelly rumble over the speakerphone. "Now we build a cannon. We need more than the lab report and a few drawings. We need a human witness. We need to break someone on their side." The target was obvious, the nurse who had administered the drops. Her name was on the old medical logs. Julian's private security team, comprised of former intelligence agents, located her within 3 hours. Her name was Helen Gable, a distant cousin of the Stern House manager, a fact that sent a chill down Julian's spine, making him question every loyalty. Helen was now working at a suburban clinic, living a quiet life. Julian and Carter's top investigator paid her a visit. At first she was terrified, denying everything, but the investigator was skilled. He didn't threaten, he empathized. He spoke of Lily. He showed her one of the child's dark, fearful drawings. He offered her full legal immunity and a lifetime of financial security and protection under a new identity. Helen broke down. She confessed that she had always been suspicious. The dosage was too high, the treatment too long. Dr. Finch had been insistent, explaining it was a new, aggressive protocol. He had paid her a substantial cash bonus to ensure her discretion. She had been too scared of the powerful doctor to speak up, a guilt she had carried for 2 years. She agreed to sign a sworn affidavit and testify against him. This was the canon Carter had wanted. Now it was time for the confrontation. Julian, against Carter's initial advice, insisted on facing Finch himself. He wanted to see the man's face when his world came crashing down. He arranged a meeting at his own office at Vance Innovations, a neutral territory where he had complete control. He had the boardroom wired for high-fidelity audio and video recording. When Dr. Finch arrived expecting to discuss the unfortunate CPS situation and offer his feigned sympathy, he found not only Julian waiting for him, but Clara as well. Finch's composure faltered for a second when he saw Clara, but he quickly recovered, his expression shifting to one of paternal concern. "Julian, my boy," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "I came as soon as I heard. This is a tragedy. This woman has clearly—" "Save it, Alistair," Julian said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He gestured to a large monitor on the wall. "Before we talk, I want you to watch something." He pressed a button. A video began to play. It was the deposition of Nurse Helen Gable. She tearfully recounted every detail of the 6-week period, describing the drops, the dosage, and Finch's insistence on secrecy. Finch's face went white. "This is slander. A disgruntled former employee." Julian pressed another button. The lab report appeared on the screen, the chemical composition of the neurosuppressant highlighted in red. "Malicious intent, Alistair. That's what the lab called it." Hiram Finch began to sweat, his eyes darting towards the door. "This is absurd. You're grasping at straws, Julian. You're unwell." It was Clara who spoke next, her voice quiet but ringing with authority. She stepped forward. "She wasn't just sick, was she, doctor?" She was scared. She tried to tell everyone, but no one would listen. She held up one of Lily's drawings, the one of the man with glasses holding the needle-like object to the little girl's ear. "She drew you, didn't she?" That was what finally broke him, the drawing, the simple, childish accusation that was more powerful than any legal document. Finch stared at it, his carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "You don't understand," he mumbled. "Thorne, he had me. The debts. He was going to ruin me." He looked up, his eyes wild with panic and desperation. "He made me do it." He had confessed. He had implicated Marcus Thorne. It was all on tape. Julian leaned back in his chair. He had his evidence. He had his confession. The next battle would be fought in a courtroom, and it would be a slaughter. The custody hearing was scheduled with remarkable speed, a testament to the pressure Benjamin Carter and Julian's public relations team applied. The narrative had already begun to shift. The leak of Nurse Gable's affidavit to a reputable news agency had turned the tide of public opinion. The story was no longer about a delusional billionaire. It was about a father fighting a monstrous conspiracy. The courtroom was packed, a silent, tense arena. Marcus Thorne was there, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers, his face an arrogant, impassive mask. Dr. Finch, looking haggard and broken, sat at a separate table, his betrayal complete. Benjamin Carter was magnificent. He didn't grandstand. He simply, methodically, and devastatingly presented the truth. He called Nurse Gable to the stand, whose tearful, detailed testimony was unshakable. He presented the lab reports with expert testimony, explaining in clear, simple terms how Lily Vance had been systematically poisoned to simulate deafness. He submitted Lily's drawings as evidence of a child's cry for help, a move that left several jury members openly weeping. But the climax of the hearing came when Carter played the secret recording of the confrontation in Julian's office. The courtroom listened in stunned silence to Dr. Finch's panicked confession and his direct implication of Marcus Thorne. Thorne's lawyers leaped to their feet, shouting objections, but the judge, her face a mask of cold fury, overruled them all. The recording was the kill shot. The case was over. The judge's ruling was swift and scathing. She immediately ordered Lily to be returned to her father's custody, issuing a formal written apology to Julian on behalf of the state for the actions of its CPS agents. She excoriated Dr. Finch, calling his actions a perversion of the sacred trust between doctor and patient, and recommended the state attorney file the most severe criminal charges possible. She then turned her gaze to Marcus Thorne. "While this is a custody hearing," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "the evidence of a criminal conspiracy presented here is overwhelming. I am referring this entire case to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation." Warrants for the arrest of both Finch and Thorne were issued before the day was out. Vindication was absolute. But for Julian and Clara, there was only one thing that mattered. They drove directly from the courthouse to the sterile foster facility where Lily had been held. A social worker led them to a small, brightly lit playroom. Lily was sitting in a corner, curled into a small ball, clutching Pip. She was rocking back and forth, her face pale and withdrawn, the light in her eyes extinguished once more. She hadn't responded to anyone in the 3 days she had been there. Clara entered the room first, her heart aching at the sight of the child's regression. "Lily," she said softly. At the sound of her voice, a voice she shouldn't have been able to hear so clearly, Lily's rocking stopped. She slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, dull and lifeless a moment before, widened. A flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition. "Clara?" The word was a tiny, fragile whisper. It was the first word she had spoken in over 2 years. It was a perfect, crystalline miracle. Clara knelt, tears streaming down her face, and opened her arms. Lily scrambled to her feet and ran, launching herself into Clara's embrace, burying her face in her shoulder and holding on with all her might. Julian entered the room behind them, his own face wet with tears. He knelt beside them, placing a hand on his daughter's back. Lily looked up from Clara's shoulder and saw him. Her eyes, so full of life now, met his. "Daddy," she whispered, the word a balm on his soul. He wrapped his arms around both of them, holding his broken, beautiful family together. The silence had been shattered, not by a shout, but by a whisper. The reunion was complete, and in the quiet of that small, sterile room, a new life, one filled with sound and love, was finally beginning. A year later, the Vance mansion was unrecognizable. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sound of life. Laughter echoed in the marble hallways. The bright, cheerful notes of a piano, played with a child's enthusiastic imperfection, often drifted from the grand living room. The heavy drapes had been replaced with light, airy curtains that let the California sun pour in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a welcome sign of a home truly lived in. The solarium was no longer a sterile memorial, but a lush, vibrant jungle, Lily's favorite place to read and draw. It was a house reborn, healed by the sound it had been denied for so long. Lily Vance was thriving, with the chemical agent long gone from her system, and with the help of a gentle, patient audiologist, her hearing had returned to near-perfect levels. The world of sound, at first overwhelming, had become a source of endless delight. She loved the crash of waves against the rocks below the house, the song of birds in the garden, and most of all, the sound of music. She was enrolled in a mainstream private school where, after a shy start, she had blossomed, making friends and astonishing her teachers with her sharp intellect and artistic talent. The wooden bird, Pip, now sat on her bedside table, a retired guardian from a darker time. Dr. Alistair Finch and Marcus Thorne were in prison. After a sensational trial that captivated the nation, they were found guilty of conspiracy, aggravated assault, and a host of other charges. They were sentenced to the maximum term, their corporate empires and professional reputations reduced to ash. Vance Innovations, on the other hand, was more successful than ever, with Julian now leading it with a renewed sense of purpose and a healthier work-life balance he had never before thought possible. Clara Mayhew was no longer the maid. She was the heart of the home. Her official title was a matter of quiet debate. Julian sometimes jokingly introduced her as his Chief Operations Officer of Domestic Happiness, but her true role was understood by all. She was Lily's mother in every way that mattered, and she was Julian's partner. Theirs was a love story, born not of whirlwind romance, but of shared trauma, quiet understanding, and the mutual fierce desire to protect a child. They were a family, forged in silence and bound by the sound they had reclaimed together. The final scene of their healing played out on a grand public stage. Julian had established the Elena Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to advocating for victims of medical malpractice and corporate malfeasance. Tonight was its inaugural charity gala, held in a grand ballroom overlooking the city. Julian, looking happier and more relaxed than anyone had ever seen him, stood at the podium. Clara, stunning in a simple, elegant gown, stood beside him, her hand resting on Lily's shoulder. Lily, in a sparkling dress, beamed at the crowd, unafraid of the hundreds of eyes upon her. "A year ago," Julian began, his voice clear and strong, "my life was silent. I thought I had lost everything worth hearing, but I was wrong. I just wasn't listening properly." He turned and smiled at Clara. "Someone came into our lives who knew how to listen to the quiet. She taught me that a person's voice isn't always heard with the ears. Sometimes it's seen in a gesture, in a drawing, in a flicker of defiance in a child's eyes." He paused, looking out at the rapt audience. My foundation is named for my late wife, Elena, a woman of incredible spirit. But its soul, its purpose, belongs to these two people beside me, to my daughter, Lily, whose strength saved us all, and to Clara, my partner in life, who heard a whisper in a silent house and had the courage to answer it. He stepped back from the podium and wrapped his arms around Clara and Lily, pulling them into a tight embrace under the warm lights. The ballroom erupted in applause. As he held them, Julian realized the true measure of his wealth had nothing to do with his bank account. It was this. It was the feeling of his daughter's small hand in his, and the quiet, steady love of the woman who had saved them. The greatest truths, he now knew, are not always spoken aloud. They are found in the patient, loving act of paying attention. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. And don't forget to let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We truly appreciate your support.